If you knew the exact day that you would die, what would you do with your life? Would you cherish the days that you have left with your family? Would you isolate yourself? Or would you work to build a world that's better for the ones who come after? I think that this question is one that needs to be asked when trying to understand the mind of Gustave in Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Because as a citizen of Lumiere, he is known, just like every child born in Lumiere knows, that he is beholden to the paintress and her countdown. And so today, I want to dive into one of the brightest minds in all of Lumiere to see if we can understand who Gustave is as a character and what motivates him at a deeper level. And so without further ado, welcome to the Psychology of Gustave. Now, in Expedition 33, something that I think is incredibly interesting is that we never really learn all too much about Gustave or his past. Yes, we learn tidbits here and there, but we never really learn in much meaningful detail what his relationship with his parents was like or what his childhood looked like. When we meet Gustave, he's in his 30s, and we know that he is in the twilight of his life. If we think about Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, which, if you're not familiar, is defined by the American Psychological Association as being a theory in which an individual's ego identity is gradually achieved by facing goals and challenges during 8 stages of development across the lifespan. And while I could talk about every stage, I think that the 3 I want to focus on while talking about Gustave specifically would have to be intimacy versus isolation, which typically occurs in young adulthood and explores whether an individual will form intimate relationships or isolate themselves. Generativity versus stagnation, which is the exploration of whether or not an individual has created or accomplished something that will outlast them and the implications of this on them personally, with this stage usually being experienced in middle adulthood, so probably when someone would be between their 40s to their 60s. And finally, in older adulthood, an individual would explore integrity versus despair, where they look back on their life and determine whether or not they've found fulfillment. Now, you might be wondering, 40s to the 60s, does this mean that people like Gustave, Sciel, or Lune will never experience the final 2 stages of psychosocial development since they will not live past their 30s? Well, if you've played the game, I'm sure you'll agree with me that no, this isn't the case at all. And it's also worth noting that you don't need to master one stage to move on to the next. People can be, and typically are, moving through multiple stages of psychosocial development at the same time to some degree. And so that brings us to today's discussion, where we're going to look through all 3 of these stages and how they are vitally important to the Gustave that we know in the game, and ultimately understanding where he's at when his story ends. When we first start the game, we're introduced to Gustave, who's throwing rocks at the monolith, which is something we'll quickly learn is not uncommon for him to do. And I think that, barring the fact that this game is just inherently beautiful in every way, I believe that this scene is incredibly striking because it really illustrates straight off the bat how Gustave has distanced himself from the world around him. It's not that he's a recluse, but in terms of people he's close with emotionally, I think that this scene really does illustrate who he is and where he's at in his life. In the intimacy versus isolation phase of development, Erik Erikson poses the existential question of, can I love? And while this question doesn't need to be limited to romantic relationships, in the case of Gustave, I think that his relationship with Sophie is hugely influential in this developmental challenge for him. We find out early on from his conversation with Maelle that at the beginning of the game, Gustave and Sophie have been separated for about 4 years. It's only on the day of her gommage that he has worked up the courage to speak with her again in order to get some semblance of closure for their relationship. As this opening segment of the game continues, we learn more and more about why the 2 of them fell apart, with Gustave wanting to have children and Sophie feeling as though, well, I'll let her say it for herself.
Do you care so little about the future of Lumiere? How can you be so selfish?
I am not selfish enough to bring others into our doomed world. I know we are not many to think like this now.
Ultimately, despite us only getting mere moments with the pair together in the game, I think that it paints a very clear picture that the 2 of them loved one another, but because of this irreconcilable difference, it ultimately drove them away from one another. Gustave was focused on bringing a child into the world so that no matter what, there would be a chance for Lumiere to have a future if one of the expeditions finally achieved their goal. As a character, he can't see a reality, or maybe more accurately, he doesn't want to see a reality where the expeditions fail and humanity goes extinct. Contrast this with Sophie, who believes, at least in part, that extinction is a very real possibility. And while both of them have points, it's not exactly a dichotomy of opinion that makes having a child together a very practical reality. And so they broke up. Not because they hated each other, and not because either one of them was inherently right or wrong, but because they were simply unable to reach a compromise, and this in turn led to Gustave isolating himself on a more intimate level romantically, to protect himself from getting hurt. Now, does this mean that he's fully cut himself off from the world, though? And the answer to that can be answered simply by looking at his relationship with Maelle. While he did isolate himself from romantic relationships, it appears that he's supplemented this lack of romantic intimacy with emotional intimacy with his family and friends. Despite not having any biological children of his own, he and his sister took in Maelle despite her being a difficult child for others in Lumiere who had tried to take her in. And this led to him becoming incredibly close with her in what could be seen as either a fatherly or a brotherly sort of way at the same time. Combine this with his friendships with other expeditioners like Lucien and his dedication to his apprentices, and I feel confident in saying that despite what happened with Sophie, he has found a way to be able to make peace with his relationships and share love in a way that is meaningful to him. And so even though he didn't end up having children with Sophie and they didn't spend the rest of their lives together romantically, I think he was able to master this idea of intimacy through his relationships with friends and family, despite not having that consistent romantic through line in his life. Okay, so he has developed good relationships with the people in Lumiere and his family. So now I want to look at Erikson's next stage of development, which is generativity versus stagnation, which, if we're honest, kind of lies at the epicenter of who Gustave is as a character and his motivation. When we think about the generativity versus stagnation phase of Erikson's theory, the question that should be at the top of our minds is essentially, have I made my life count? Or to say it a bit differently, what am I leaving behind? And I think it's fair to say that this question lies at the heart of Gustave's character and the expeditions in general. Just think about it. Throughout Act 1, we see time and time again that Gustave has a near eidetic memory when it comes to the history of Lumiere and the expeditions that have come before them. He's the inventor of the Lumina converter, the device that allows them to gather chroma from the Neverons and utilize Lumina. He has worked to maintain the shield over Lumiere to keep the Neverons at bay and keep the citizens safe. All of this combined shows very explicitly what he has personally done towards building the future of Lumiere, so that even once he dies, whether during the expedition itself or through the Gommage, he will have ensured the betterment of society and left the world better than what he'd found it, for the future of mankind as a whole, whether that's for a few more years or in perpetuity. I mean, the reason he was so dead set on having a child was to build towards Lumiere's future, because even if they are able to defeat the Paintress, if there are no children to live in the future that so many people had given their lives to win, then what's really the point? Gustave struggles to find contentment outside of fighting for the future or fighting back against the Paintress. What they've done needs to mean something, and they cannot let down the people of Lumiere. That's why he had taken on 3 protégés, so that no matter what, his work doesn't die with him. And they are clearly quick studies, as they're the ones who had created his arm for him, which, now that I think about it, we still don't actually know how he lost his arm. It's not really important to the story at all, but I don't know, I think I'd like to know that story. But I digress. This is also why he took on Maelle, and why he's so resistant to her coming along on the expedition, because he doesn't want her to throw away her future, while she still has several years ahead of her until her inevitable gamage. But what happens when all of that crashes down? While he's ready and confident at the beginning of the expedition, when they land on the beach, Renoir and the Nevrons immediately begin to annihilate everyone before they're even able to begin orienting themselves. Suddenly, all of his planning for the future, all of the people he had cared about, everything was being ripped away from him, and he isn't able to do anything to stop it because he can't even comprehend what's going on. In his mind, Expedition 33 is over. They're being wiped out systematically by something they could never have anticipated in Renoir. And so Gustave freezes. Yes, Lucien saves him, but even still, he's overtaken by a Nevron, only to wake up alone, forced to continue forward, not having any idea what the fate of the rest of the expedition was. That is, until he reaches a cave. And it's here that he sees the unimaginable horror of countless expeditioners' bodies stacked unceremoniously in massive piles, blood everywhere, and the recently dead body of Catherine, someone he was close with on the expedition, being front and center. I think that there's nothing that could prepare someone for seeing that, and so being overwhelmed by everything, he decides that maybe it would be best to end his own journey. I cannot personally imagine the intense and visceral internal turmoil that he had to be feeling in this moment. From the physiological experience caused by the intense shock of everything, to struggling to get his heart rate under control, to being physically on death's door himself when he woke up in the spring meadows, and pairing these symptoms with the mental turmoil he's assuredly experiencing, like survivor's guilt, the grief from watching so many people he knows get killed in a way that they could have never imagined. It takes Gustave down a dark path. Despite Gustave having a gun to his temple for who knows how long, Lune does end up finding him before it was too late. And even though some part of him believes that they're already dead, despite these beliefs, however, he doesn't abandon Lune. I think that credit must be given to both Gustave and Lune for having the mental fortitude to persevere through such intense and mentally taxing situations. And while Gustave understandably doesn't bounce back immediately and maintains his much more muted affect as they approach the indigo tree, he is able to slowly start coming back to himself when he sees the message that Maelle is likely safe. Though now he has fully shifted his goal to wanting to protect the one person whose life he values above all others. I do want to note though that while it's clear he's experiencing all of this internal strife and conflict, it's mainly impacting his worldview. He is so focused on figuring out whether or not he cares more about Maelle or their mission to defeat the Paintress. And with this conflict in mind, we need to take a look at role theory in psychology, which is defined by the American Psychological Association as a conceptual explanation of social behavior that assumes individuals' actions are defined in part by the role they occupy in a relationship, such as being a father, a daughter, a group member, a leader, an employee, a boss, and so on and so forth. The theory suggests that by enacting roles, individuals establish exchange relationships with one another, building interdependence that is essential for social coordination. This means that Gustave now has to figure out whether his role of being a father is in conflict with his role as an expeditioner. As a father, Maelle's safety would of course take priority over everything, whereas as an expeditioner, the mission takes precedence. And until he actually sees Maelle with his own eyes, I think that he's telling the truth when he tells Lune that he hopes he still believes that the future of Lumiere is more important to him than a single life. Ultimately though, Maelle makes these roles align for him very quickly when she shows no interest in going back to Lumiere, and so this brings his goals of following through with the mission and his goal of protecting Maelle into harmony once more, which brings us to what he is doing to work toward the betterment of society, and that is, of course, continuing with the expedition, but also keeping up with his journal so that his apprentices can hopefully find it one day and learn from his experiences. But as we know, Gustave will not be able to be the one to hand over his journal himself. Once we are reunited with Maelle and in the process meet the Gestural Noko, we get to see who Gustave is. When talking with Lune at the campsite, he tells her that now that the shock of everything has worn off, he is set on destroying the paintress once more, especially because now they have Maelle with them. This in turn opens the gates to allowing us to see more of who Gustave really is. We see him warning Maelle to run if they ever see the man on the beach again. We see him joking that he will run as fast as he can to get away, and we see his fatherly instincts kick in after Maelle sees a vision of Renoir and Alicia by the fire as he tries to shield her from Lune's line of questioning. And just in general, we get really fun moments like this one.
Hey.
Come on. Don't be shy.
Get out of my way!
Jeez, un poquito más, Parino.
No. It's the password.
Ultimately, once he is surrounded by Maelle, Lune, and eventually Sciel and Esquier, he is able to bounce back. Yes, the future looks bleak, but he is able to separate himself from the darkness and the isolation he had felt when he woke up alone. He was plunged into the darkness by Renoir, but the rest of the party was able to pull him back into the light. The game allows us to really see and learn about Gustave without having to exposit everything about his character. For instance, when he's overwhelmed by emotion, he has trouble finishing his sentences and fully articulating what he is thinking in a coherent way. We see that he, more than other characters, uses body language to share exactly how he's feeling or thinking, and we see when he picks the flower up just before the Go-Blue attacks that he still grieves the loss of Sophie, despite not articulating it. This could allude to his particular style of grief, which if you've watched AMI Psychology content in the past, we've talked about these styles oh so much. And in the context of Expedition 33, we'll probably talk about them again, but if you aren't familiar, there are 3 core grief styles that have been proposed by Drs. Terry Martin and Kenneth Doka that operate along a continuum, with these styles being instrumental grief, or people who want to experience their grief more intellectually or physically. In essence, the individual will want to have control over their emotions, and they'll focus more on trying to solve problems and complete tasks to cope with their grief. The second style on the opposite side of the continuum is intuitive grief, which is characterized by a heightened experience and expression of emotion and a desire to talk about the loss. And the third is a blended grief style, where the individual displays both intuitive and instrumental attributes. Now, as we know, once Sophie's gone, she isn't exactly a common topic of conversation for him, with her only really coming up when he's talking to Sciel at the campsite as they are reminiscing about Aqua Farm 3.
Aquafarm 3.
Aquafarm 3.
Aquafarm 3.
It's not that he refuses to talk about her or acknowledge the loss of someone he cares so deeply about, or for that matter, the loss of countless people he cares about throughout the course of his life. Instead, he decides to follow the creed of the expedition that if one falls, he continues, something that he struggled with earlier on in the expedition. Though I want to make sure that we are fully on the same page, that it's not really his mission to defeat the paintress that's driving him forward at this point. It's not his role as an expeditioner that has taken front and center stage, at least I don't think so. I think it's his role as a father or a brother to Maelle that now motivates him. While he is clearly working closely with everyone to be able to progress with the mission of the expedition to defeat the paintress, and to some extent I do think he wants to be doing this, that doesn't change the fact that now it is his goal above all else to protect and look after Maelle at all costs. In order to manage his grief instrumentally, he has latched onto protecting who he has left with all that he is. If he is primarily coping with his grief instrumentally though, does that mean that he won't display emotions? Because I think I remember him displaying emotions throughout the course of the game, and well, no. Pretty much all grief styles are blended to some degree. I would say that Gustave tends to lean more into an instrumental grief style on the whole, as opposed to an intuitive grief style. And this ultimately leads us to the Stone Wave Cliffs, where after defeating the Lampmaster and finding Flory for Esquier, he and Maelle are looking for some rocks to throw before setting out for the monolith. And this is where everything goes wrong. It's here that Renoir appears and decides to wordlessly remove Gustave from the board. And it's hard to know what was going through Gustave's mind as he turned towards Renoir. But with Maelle being behind him, the stakes aren't the same now as they were on the beach. He knows the terror that he's facing, and instead of attempting to flee or instead of freezing up like last time, he knows there's no option left but to fight. And while Gustave tries to talk with Renoir and understand why he's doing this, he gets nothing in return. And so he uses everything in his arsenal to defeat Renoir, using his overcharge ability, but it's not nearly enough. The final stage of Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development is integrity versus despair. Essentially, it's an exploration and a reflection on one's own life, and while I think it's very likely that throughout the entirety of the game, Gustave was thinking about whether or not his life has had meaning, regardless of what he's thought up to these final moments, or even what we as the audience might think, in his final moments of life, he says this.
For those who come after. Right?
No. You promised!
And while after this he turns and charges at Renoir with the last ounce of life that he has in him, the uncertainty in that statement chilled me to my core, because Gustave knows that he won't live to see whether or not Maelle and the rest of the party live through this. He doesn't know whether everything that had led him to this point was worth it or not. All he does know is that he doesn't have the time to process that. All he can do is act and hope that he's done enough. Gustave is a character that was vital to the success of the expedition and to the events of the game long after his death. Without his Lumina converter, it's likely that Expedition 33 would have never gotten as far as they did. His journal lived well beyond him, with Maelle taking up the mantle of writing to his apprentices about their travels. And whether it was his work on Aquafarm 3, or through his role as an expeditioner, or a father, or a brother, or a friend, or a partner to Sophie, I think that we can all agree that Gustave was able to make a difference, whether he recognized it in his final moments or not.